Good evening, everybody. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU. And I would like to welcome you all sehr, sehr herzlich to our newly renovated house. A warm welcome also to German Ambassador Dr. Peter Wittig and to the German Consul General in New York, Britta Wagner. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming. Tonight, we are very proudly awarding the second Volkmar and Margret Zander Award to the distinguished executive director of the American Academy in Berlin, Dr. Gary Smith. Dr. Gary Smith has facilitated the development of an extensive network of corporate, political, academic, and cultural communities of Germany and the United States through his executive role at one of Europe's most visible and effective institutions of transatlantic dialogue. The American Academy, by the way, just celebrated its 20th birthday. Happy belated birthday. And of course, we're also about to celebrate another very big anniversary, the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I know is very close to many of us here in this room, probably to all of us. And in the context of this big anniversary, we here at Deutsches Haus present a whole series of events commemorating this amazing change in world history. Dr. Smith came to the Academy from the Einstein Forum, an influential international forum for scholarly debate, which he founded in Potsdam in 1992, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Dr. Smith's innumerable contributions to the innovative dialogue between the scholarly and public spheres and his expert commentary on political affairs in the German news media have made him a very highly respected political and moral authority in German public and academic life. Please let me say a few words about the wonderful Volkmar and Margret Zander Prize before we proceed. The Volkmar and Margret Zander Prize was established by Professor Margret Zander in memory of her late husband, Professor Volkmar Zander, former head of the German department of NYU and founder and first director of Deutsches Haus at NYU. The prestigious annual prize, which was awarded for the first time in 2013 to Professor Fritz Stern, is endowed with a $5,000 grant and honors individuals who have made outstanding contributions to the cultural, political, and academic relationship between the German-speaking world and the United States. You can see how Gary Smith is a perfect fit for this prize. Margret Zander, who resides in Germany and whom I spoke to on the phone earlier today, unfortunately cannot be here tonight. She, however, sends you all her, she said, allerherzlichste Grüße, and would like you to know how very important this day is to her. Not only because of tonight's ceremony, but also today would have been her husband's birthday. And I should mention that last week it was Margret's 90th birthday. Of course, I don't need to tell you how enormously we at Deutsches Haus are grateful to Margret Zander for establishing and generously endowing this annual award to be awarded by Deutsches Haus at NYU. It means so much to us to be given this amazing opportunity to honor such worthy and esteemed individuals as Professor Fritz Stern and Dr. Gary Smith. I would also like to thank our good friends, Professor Eckhard Goebel, chair of the German department at NYU, and Professor Friedrich Ulfers, who just celebrated his 80th birthday, if I may say that, also from the German department, for their tremendous help, support, and inspiration in the preparation of this year's Volkmar and Margret Zander Preis. Vielen, vielen herzlichen Dank an euch beide. Thank you so much. And a great thank you also to the Friends of Volkmar and Margret Zander, a group of wonderful people who continue to be great supporters of the prize. They had a wonderful meeting yesterday here to commemorate Volkmar and to honor Margret. It was nice to witness that. Let me also thank Gary Smith's great colleagues at the American Academy, Susan Woosley and Karsten Appel, for their help in organizing this very special event. Former German federal president Dr. Richard von Weizsäcker was unfortunately not able to attend the evening tonight. Given his close relationship with Gary Smith, the former federal president, however, was so kind to send us the following Grußbotschaft message to be shared with you tonight. And we are so happy and honored that Ambassador Wittig has agreed to read this message to us. Thank you so much. And please join me in welcoming Ambassador Wittig.
Good evening. Thank you, Ms. Campfield. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy to be here. I feel especially attached to the Deutsches Haus, not only because it's such a vibrant and unique cultural institutions in this rich New York landscape, but because also last year I had the honor and the great pleasure to deliver the laudation for the first awardee of the Sonderpreis, my friend Fritz Stern, and today I've gotten another pleasant assignment to deliver the message of former federal President Richard von Weizsäcker at this occasion. You know that Richard von Weizsäcker is a revered figure still in German public life, and incidentally one of the founding fathers of the American Academy. So I read his message. Gary Smith has been a key figure in the US-German relationship for many years and has helped us to shape our view on recent debates in America and stimulated the transatlantic dialogue like few others. With outstanding dedication, he fostered old relations and created new ones and enriched the social and cultural life of Berlin and Germany with his and his guests' highly capable contributions. Gary led the American Academy Berlin to become the very center of transatlantic discourse, both in political and in cultural affairs. With his warm personality and his profound knowledge in manifold areas, Gary made the Academy also a unique place of real human encounter. I'm therefore especially grateful to learn that the Deutsches Haus at New York University is awarding Gary Smith with the second Volkmar and Margret Sonderpreis. The Deutsches Haus and the American Academy in Berlin are led by the same central principles of promoting exchange and bringing our countries closer together. Both Volkmar Sander and his first recipient of the prize, my dear friend Fritz Stern, are outstanding examples of a lifelong endeavor to reach these goals. Honoring Gary's extraordinary achievements, the prize also is an incentive to him as well as to us all not to relent in our efforts to face today's manifold challenges and to intensify our transatlantic partnership. My congratulations to Gary are therefore strongly connected with the hope that he will continue to influence our German society with his thoughts and ideas and to further enhance the intellectual exchange between Germany and the United States. Richard von Weizsäcker. And I gladly associate myself with those wise words of the former president. Gary, you have been such a key figure in creating and shaping this wonderful institution, American Academy, which really is, I would say, one of the crown jewels of German-American institutions. So also my warm congratulations for the prize, and thank you for the Deutsches Haus to host us tonight. Thank you.
We will ask you to return next year for the third annual prize. We are absolutely delighted that tonight's laudation, or intro, in honor of Gary Smith will be held by George Packer. George Packer is a staff writer for The New Yorker and the author of The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, which received numerous prizes and was named one of the 10 best books of 2005 by the New York Times Book Review. He's the author of the play Betrayed and the novels The Half Men and Central Square, and also of the works of nonfiction The Village of Waiting, Blood of the Liberals, and The Unwinding, an inner history of the New America, which won the National Book Award for nonfiction about a year ago in 2013, and was just published in German translation, by the way, and I found it very interesting that the translation of that title is Die Abwicklung. So that's a good word. Without further ado, I would now like to ask George Packer to come up to the podium and to present the laudation, or intro, as he would prefer to call it, for Gary Smith.
Thank you. Laudation just put way too much pressure on this, as if I thought I had to rewrite it in Latin couplets. But I didn't have time, so it's an intro. And it's an honor to be asked to give the intro to Gary Smith and this much-deserved prize. But Gary, in doing the research for this talk, I noticed on your Wikipedia page you are referred to as the acting director of the American Academy in Berlin since 1998, which seemed like a long time not to get the job, you know. And I think you should you should have that changed before it's too late and you're the former director. Right. So when I think of Gary Smith, I see him sitting in his office at the American Academy in Berlin on the second floor of the Arnhold Villa, with a window view out across Lake Wannsee. He's in shirt sleeves and a tie, with his jacket draped across the chair. And he's juggling a phone call to someone important in New York, a minor crisis at the Academy involving a misunderstanding between one of the fellows and a staff member, and the piece for Berlin Journal that he's trying to finish writing before the dinner event he has to attend, an event that he claims he'd rather miss. In fact, he doesn't know why he ever said yes, because he hasn't had time to read the new book on the Frankfurt School, which sits at the top of one of the many precarious piles of reading matter that clutter the shelf behind his desk. He's slightly out of breath with all this activity, smiling almost helplessly as if he's a spectator at the drama of his own hectic life. But he still makes time to talk with me. Our subject could be the book I'm working on about Richard Holbrooke, or the state of German-American relations in the shadow of the NSA scandal, or his life after he leaves the Academy. And as we talk, Gary's characteristic mumbling and self-interrupting, which are the sound of a mind going off in 5 directions at once, gradually clarify into intelligible sentences. Only after you've secured Gary's undivided attention for 10 minutes do you realize how brilliant he is. That brilliance is Gary's own achievement, of course, but it also belongs to his cultural inheritance. The combination of vast reading, lightning-quick connections, sudden plunges into original insight, a kind of melancholy-tinged enthusiasm. That's the intellectual style of certain German Jewish immigrants in the United States. Gary's mother was born into a family, the Krohns, in Königsberg, East Prussia, in 1933. That has an ominous sound, but fortunately she escaped Germany in 1939 by way of Cuba to Florida. Gary's aunts also survived the Nazis, though one had to endure a concentration camp in Holland after being turned away from the US and other countries on board the refugee ship St. Louis. Gary's father was a Jew named Smith, which an immigration officer at Ellis Island apparently thought was close enough to Skolnitsky. Which appropriately means student, apparently. Gary was born in New Orleans in 1954 and grew up in Austin, Texas, where his father had a dental practice. Gary Smith always sounded to me like a rather unimaginative pseudonym. Under that name, Gary could have passed for an ordinary Texas boy, but that was not his destiny. From early on, he loved books, and the love of books led him in 6th grade to begin his lifelong study of German. Gary's attraction to German was a way of identifying himself with his mother's family, the Krones, with the world that they had left behind in fleeing Königsberg, and with the life of the mind that characterized German Jewish culture, literature, philosophy, politics. At 16, he wrote a play about the Holocaust called The Shower Curtain, in German Terze Rima. Fortunately, no known copy survives. At the age of 18, he discovered the philosopher and essayist Walter Benjamin and began collecting documents, photographs, and other traces of Benjamin's life, which began in Berlin. Gary went off to Germany on a scholarship in 1974 at the age of 20. His mother hated the idea of this return to the old country, and she made Gary promise he wouldn't set foot in East Berlin for fear that she'd never see him again. As things turned out, Gary was not kidnapped by the Stasi. It was Germany itself that took him as a hostage, an entirely willing one, and never let him go. By his early 30s, Gary had acquired the largest collection of Benjamin archival material in the world, 12,000 pages in all. He sold it to a museum in Berlin for 25,000 Deutschmarks and used the money to write his first book, Benjaminiana, an irreverent and ironic work, or so I'm told. It's in German, so I can't verify this, but I believe it, whose content was chosen for its expressive power rather than for simple biographical dutifulness. It was daringly illustrated in the ironic manner of the great German magazines of the Weimar years. From there, Gary went on to found the Einstein Forum in 1992, a multidisciplinary think tank in Potsdam. He led it for 4 years before getting bored. When Gary gets bored, he leaves. And fortunately, in the 5th year, he met Richard Holbrooke, who changed Gary's life and the lives of others by selecting him to run a new institution called the American Academy in Berlin. From the beginning, the idea behind the Academy was to bring together American scholars, writers, and artists in a mix that would create intellectual combustion. Fire needs oxygen, and the oxygen of the American Academy was the city of Berlin. The timing of the Academy's founding in 1998 could not have been better. The energy of this new institution, founded in the new capital of a new Germany and led by its wildly energetic new executive director, not acting. Gary didn't want the Academy's fellows to shut themselves up inside their work at the Villa. He wanted to build as many bridges as possible between the Academy and German life. So he organized art gallery exhibitions, public lectures, musical performances, interviews with German journalists, political debates, newspaper and magazine publications. These are the real work of the Academy. And as a 2-time former fellow, I can attest that I sometimes had to fight off Gary's advances just to get a little of my own work done. Gary is a scholar without being an academic, a cultural manager without being a bureaucrat. He's resisted labels and limits, and sometimes the disapproval of his own board. After all, budgets are ephemeral things. A Jenny Holzer exhibition at the Neue National Gallery is eternal. I struggled to think of the right word for what Gary does until he gave it to me by calling himself a collector. I think that's a good description, but it doesn't go far enough. Gary collects books, ideas, and people. He brings people together who otherwise would never meet. And he takes a great and unselfish pleasure in watching the flowers pollinate and bloom. I have many new friends and colleagues among German journalists, writers, and political people in Berlin whom I owe to Gary's generosity. I think it's his refusal to be bound by institutional constraints that has allowed Gary to preserve the flame of youthful enthusiasm for people and ideas rather than letting it quietly go out, which usually happens well before you turn 60. Sorry, Gary. Gary is also one of those rare visionaries who actually gets things done. A few years ago, not long after the tragic and untimely death of Richard Holbrooke, Gary joined me and my wife, Laura, on our deck in Brooklyn for a barbecue dinner. He always has something going on, something in his mind, some plan, some project, some gleam in the eye. And this time he wanted to tell us about his new idea of a vaguely defined forum at the Academy that would take its inspiration from Holbrook's lifelong engagement with diplomacy, public policy, and ideas. It wasn't completely clear what it would become, but it was clear that Gary was going to make it happen, because that's what he does. And this past June, I was lucky to be included in the first session of the Richard C. Holbrooke Forum for the Study of Diplomacy and Governance at the Academy. The vision is of a center where thinkers and policymakers can meet not just to talk things over, but to affirm common values and work on hard problems. It was Gary's vision and Gary's baby from the start. This past spring, Laura and I were fellows together at the Academy for the second time. Gary has been a keen supporter of Laura's book on the intellectual and political history of the democratic movement in Iran. Really, Gary's interest has been so important to Laura that it has almost inspired a weird kind of intellectual jealousy in her husband. When she publishes the book next year, Gary will have a certain place in her acknowledgments, as he did in my last book, The Unwinding. One day in May, Laura had an accident on a Berlin sidewalk and hit her head. She needed to get to the hospital, and Gary immediately offered to drive. This was a characteristic act of generosity. And our trip to the hospital in Zehlendorf was also characteristic. Traveling at insanely high speeds, taking 3 or 4 wrong turns into blocked-off streets, making illegal U-turns, Gary spent the entire drive talking nonstop about the Holbrooke Forum. Or so I remember it. Maybe it was Walter Benjamin. I pretended to be listening because I sensed that forcing Gary to focus on the more urgent but mundane task at hand might actually make it less likely that we would get there in one piece or at all. Somehow we arrived at the hospital, where Gary talked Laura's way past the front desk without completely abandoning his riff on the Holbrooke Forum. Or was it Benjamin? I was struck by his spoken German. After all these years, he still had a heavy American accent, and the admitting nurse had some trouble understanding him. Now, to me, holding on to one's own accent while living in a foreign country is a sign of character. But at that moment, I also had a realization. Gary's trouble navigating Berlin's streets within a few miles of the Academy, where he's devoted the past 2 decades of his life, his facility in writing philosophical and literary German prose while having difficulty making himself understood in a German emergency room, all this told me that Gary lives most profoundly in a Berlin of the mind, and that his long love affair with Germany has been first and last an intellectual passion. That passion has been my and our great good luck. May it continue to inspire the Academy that he's made such a tremendous success, and may it inspire Gary as he pursues his next enthusiasms. Thank you.
And now please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Dr. Gary Smith, whom I will now award with another collector's item, the certificate. Please join me.
Whatever I prepared is totally relevant after that talk. My mind is going in at least 5 different directions. I have, thank you for the interruption. I have a lot of thank yous to make, but none more than George for taking the time and interviewing me and producing something which my parents, who have never really been able to explain to anybody what I do for a living since I started the Einstein Forum, will now at least have something that they can use to make the first attempt. Fritz Stern was the first recipient, and I felt a little odd being the second, because Fritz Stern is somebody who I've always revered, who, as a place in my Doktorarbeit, who when I was a editorial assistant, the lowest of low editors at the collected papers of Albert Einstein was on my board at the Academy, at the Einstein Forum, and then at the Academy. So this is very honoring. The only interesting note I can say is that I feel very strongly, Kati, hello, that I stand for another generation of people who care about this relationship, who grew up Germany being central to our lives biographically through our parents. And some of my friends here are of that generation, and we see each other in Berlin all the time. And I stand for that generation, and I'm one of many. It's not, it's not any false modesty when I say that I really personally don't deserve this award, but the award is really due to the historical circumstances of that changing relationship and this symbolism between Germany and America, and something that one has to be very aware of, something that I personally cannot bear to hear another politician talk about our common values, because values are not something that are written in stone. They're not something, they need articulation. They're a product of historical circumstance. They're not genetically, one hasn't discovered the gene yet. They're not genetically passed on. And part of what I think that we, all of us do, is we articulate and explore and challenge those values, something that I think we're very aware of at this present moment, in which Stephen Kellen, the great founding benefactor of the Academy, would have said, the world is unwinding, the world is out of control again. And so it's been living in Germany, listening to also changing political discourse, one which was in fact almost absent for a while, being through the foreign minister now and the president and others, the serious talk about responsibility, the talk which is a discourse which only 3 or 4 years ago was still explicitly about the moral high ground, about America's moral stature and loss and gain. This was, in fact, it was Fritz Stern who articulated this in 2011, and now we're not talking about that anymore. We're really trying to find that. We're trying to articulate those values and how they translate into action. So that's one of the 5 strands. We'll just leave it there. I do want to say that I will be very brief, because we're about to hear Macbeth sing an aria, and Željko Lučić is one of the truly great Verdi baritones of our time, who I heard sing many times when I lived in Frankfurt in the late 90s and 2000, in those years when I was working at the Adorno Archives. Then when I came to Berlin, I heard him in Dresden, and it's thanks to Katharina Fürstenberg-Rettig that after having sung his last performance at the Met 2 nights ago of Macbeth, that he's going to sing for us here. I do want to say there's no symbolism involved here. I'm not trying to evoke like Shakespeare's relationship to, his benefactor James I. This has nothing to do with my relationship to my benefactors. I'm grateful for the trustees that are here. I'm especially grateful to Steve Burbank, who came up from Philadelphia, and to Kati Martin, who Holbrook's widow and an important writer on her own. As George said, Holbrook should have gotten an award like this, because Richard Holbrook was one of the transformative figures of my time and my experience. He certainly changed my life, and everybody who happened to get near to him. I mean, if you got too near, then he sort of grabbed you. He really collected you. And the stories are legend of his 12 months as ambassador to Bonn, 93 to 94, just before he went to the Balkans, back to the State Department and then to the Balkans to do the Dayton Accords. But Joel Levy was actually, there are a lot of people here responsible for me having this job, and I do have to thank Joel Levy, who was the public affairs officer and a friend in Berlin at the time, who has described how Holbrooke arrived. He was there for 12 months, and within days he had everybody collected in Berlin and said, okay, in 12 months the Berlin Brigade marches out of Berlin. This is a major event. What are we going to do? And that's when the idea of the Academy was born, and Holbrooke understood, it was prescient about how the relationship would change, how important Germany was, and he knew how to take 12 months or less and make them into something which was lasting. So so Katja, I'm really glad that you made it back from Budapest in time to come to this. Juliana, of course, when you called, I was delighted. I thought it was about your uncle, who was my teacher in art history at Rice, and who I admire and greatly. And actually, that was in another context. I have a few thank yous to say, but I want to talk about two things. One is mentorship, philanthropy, exchange. That was the first time that what I do is really a reflection of what I've experienced. I've experienced many mentors, the generosity of countries and institutions. When I was 16 in Austin, Texas, of all places, the German government used to send a German-speaking writer to Austin, of all places, for up to a semester every year. So at the age of 16, Max Frisch came for 6 weeks. Then Kuhner, in New York, of course, you're inured to this kind of thing, but in Texas, believe me, this was quite odd. Günter Kuhnertz, Heine Müller, and then the great writer Siegfried Unseld, who wrote me a recommendation for the DAAD, which got me to Germany. But this kind of passion for sending, for communicating your culture and ideas, for exchange. When I applied to the DAAD, I really wanted to go to Paris, like all Central Texans. But there were 4 grants to Paris, and there were 80 to Germany through the DAAD and Fulbright. That's had a tremendous impact on my generation and of people who've come to Germany and benefited from this generosity. Then there's the scholar, I guess, entrepreneur, or it's more than that, like Volkmar Zander, who was published hundreds of articles on people that we're all interested in, from Murica, of course, to Benjamin, to Heine, and also had an important corpus of literary theoretical writings, and nonetheless started and completed this extraordinary project of 100 volumes, the German Library, to convey in English translation what is German culture to the English-speaking world. This is something that is as important today as it was then, especially given our need to understand more about each other. And I would submit that in the United States, there's still very little understood about Germany, at least in the diplomatic world. The questions are, what is it about those Germans? Why aren't they supporting our sanctions? It must be, and then the answers are obvious. So it's important to continue this work and intensify it. And the Academy, the Einstein Forum, other institutions that are here, represented here, it's very important that you continue this work. It's transformative in terms of our own self-understanding. And I think, I guess one word about the Academy, Hans Magnus Enzensberger wrote an article when there was the Tiefdruckbeilage of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and those were the great days, and it was a 2-page article, Gegen Ereigniskultur, against event culture. And I took that as my motto when I started the Einstein Forum, and it's the same here. You can always fly people in and out for conferences and lectures, but it's a greater challenge to bring somebody And you can bring them to a Center for Advanced Studies and have them interact with their colleagues that you've flown in to work on subjects or projects. But the real challenge is twofold. One is to transmit those ideas into different cultures that aren't part of that aren't just colleagues, the public sphere, and to take the risk of doing such because it's uncomfortable to engage in these conversations with people that aren't colleagues. It's uncomfortable enough if you're, a literary theorist to talk to a security, non-nuclear proliferation expert. But then when you transmit the ideas into the public sphere and you engage in this dialogue, it's difficult, it's uncomfortable, and that's, I think, for me, what's been very gratifying is seeing that it works and that all the fellows that are here have found that Germany is very receptive to this kind of dialogue. I mean, Germany we have the New York Review of Books, we have a few magazines. In Germany, I could exist before I had a job, by the way, and I lived off my wife, who says she's sorry she couldn't be here. I could write about Gershom Scholem for the Berlin radio, and I could survive from this, and Benjamin and other things. You could write. I worked for the Taz, the Tageszeitung, and the FAZ, and people could live as intellectuals without being professors, without working on exhibitions. This is something that is very different from our world of the university, or we also have independent scholars and composers and novelists. But it's something that is, I think, transformative for the people who come. It certainly changes their work, and it's important, I think, for the relationship. This has nothing to do with anything I wrote down, but I have thanked almost anyone. It was really, I don't know how to say it, to ask George to do this was, I don't do this usually. It was a Frechheit. It was sort of, but that's a true friend that you did this, and I'm very, very, very grateful. I see so many people who have helped me, Drozak, other friends. Anyway, this is what we do. I can tell you from the 400 and odd, they're not all odd, fellows that we've had, and there's thousands of speakers and short-term visitors. It does have an effect. It has an effect on those who are here, those who've come from Washington and Philadelphia and different places, and Bard and upstate New York. And I was privileged to, as my fellow New Orleans native Dr. John said, I was in the right place at the right time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring speech and for dedicating your life to the transatlantic dialogue, which is so important to all of us here. And I think the speech is an Aufforderung to continue talking with each other and to improve the transatlantic relationships. And we will always remember this moment, I believe. It's very touching. Thank you. Thank you. As Gary mentioned, a performance by renowned opera singer Željko Lučić will now conclude this award ceremony, and I also want to follow Gary in thanking Catherine Fürstenberg-Rettig for arranging this, and of course a big thank you to Željko Lučić for singing, for performing. As you know, he is currently singing Macbeth at the Metropolitan Opera. My colleague was there on Saturday, and she said he was kind of good. So we were we were very happy that we'd asked him through Catherine to perform here tonight. So please join me in welcoming Željko and George, the pianist, who will accompany him.
stati, la tuo figlio a te concedo riveder nell'ombra e nel silenzio là il tuo rossore lontavia nascondi. Colpire l'eccio altro, ben altro sangue a terger dessi l'offesa il sangue tuo e lo trarai il pugnale allo sveale tuo cuore delle lacrime vendicator l'odio e la morte nel veto
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, George Packer. Thank you, Ambassador Wittig. Thank you, Željko and George. And thank you all for coming. I think it was a marvelous evening, and we look forward to having a glass of wine with you now to toast Gary. Thank you so much. Thank you.